The streets hummed with the sound of city life. Cars rushing by, people chatting, the distant melody of a street performer playing for spare change. But amidst all this noise, 17-year-old Liam only heard silence. Not the kind that calms the mind, but the kind that crushes the soul. His violin, his most precious possession, lay shattered in its case. The strings snapped. The wood splintered from a fall he never saw coming. Just hours ago, Liam had been playing his heart out in the park, hoping to earn enough for his music, school tuition. The violin was old, passed down from his grandfather, but it still sang beautifully until fate had other plans. A careless shove from a passing cyclist sent the case tumbling, and before Liam could react, the damage was done. He could still hear the sickening crack, still feel the panic rising in his chest as he knelt to pick up the broken pieces. Now, sitting on a cold bench, staring at what once was his lifeline, Liam felt something he hadn't in a long time: hopelessness. Music wasn't just a hobby for him. It was his dream, his escape from a life that hadn't always been kind. Without his violin, how could he keep going? As he sat there, lost in thought, a shadow fell over him. "That's a painful sight," a voice said, deep and gentle. Liam looked up to see a man standing before him, his features hidden under a well-worn hat and a thick scarf wrapped around his neck. There was something about him, an air of quiet confidence. The way his hands rested easily in his coat pockets, as if he carried no burdens of his own. Liam swallowed hard, embarrassed. "Yeah," he mumbled. "It's ruined." The man crouched down, his fingers grazing the cracked wood. He studied the damage, tilting his head slightly, as if he could still hear the music that once played from it. Then, to Liam's surprise, he smiled. "Not ruined," he said. "Just in need of a little care." Liam frowned. "I don't have the money to fix it." The man didn't seem concerned. Instead, he straightened and pulled out a small, worn notebook from his coat pocket. He scribbled something down, tore off a piece of paper, and handed it to Liam. "There's a shop a few blocks from here. Show this to the luthier." Liam glanced down at the note. It was a name, just a name, and an address. No explanation, no reason why a stranger would help him. "Why are you doing this?" Liam asked, suspicious, but desperate enough to listen. The man smiled again, but this time, there was something unreadable in his expression. Because every musician deserves a second chance. And just like that, he was gone, disappearing into the crowd before Liam could ask any more questions. Liam hesitated. Was this a cruel joke? A wild goose chase? But something inside him, maybe hope, maybe sheer desperation, urged him forward. Clutching the paper tightly, he made his way toward the address. When he arrived, the shop was nothing like he expected. It wasn't flashy or even particularly inviting. It was small, tucked between towering buildings. Its wooden sign faded with age. But inside, the scent of varnish and sawdust filled the air, and instruments in various stages of repair lined the walls. An older man looked up from his workbench as Liam stepped inside. His eyes, sharp but kind, landed on the violin case in Liam's hands. "You must be the one he sent," he said, nodding toward the paper still clutched in Liam's fingers. Liam blinked. "You know him." The man chuckled. "Oh, I know him well." Liam opened his mouth to ask more, but before he could, the luthier gestured toward the violin. "Let's see what we can do." For the next hour, Liam watched in awe as the craftsman examined every crack, every splinter, treating the broken instrument like an old friend who had simply lost their way. There was no rush, no frustration, just patience, skill, and care. By the time the man finished, The violin wasn't perfect, but it was whole again. Liam ran his fingers over the polished wood, hardly believing it was the same instrument he had almost given up on. "Go on," the luthier said. "Play something." Liam hesitated, his heart pounding. He hadn't played a single note since the accident, but as he lifted the violin to his shoulder, something in him settled. He took a deep breath and let the bow glide across the strings. The first note was shaky, uncertain, but then, as the familiar tones filled the small shop, everything else faded away. The doubt, the worry, the fear. All that remained was the music. When he finished, the luthier nodded in approval. "Good as new." Liam exhaled, his hands shaking. Thank you, but I still don't understand why he helped me." The older man wiped his hands on a cloth and leaned against the workbench. "You will." Liam left the shop feeling lighter than he had in days, but the mystery of the stranger still gnawed at him. Who was he? Why did he care? It wasn't until weeks later that Liam found out. One evening, as he scrolled through his phone, a video caught his eye. A performance at a grand concert hall. A violinist stood on stage, his bow moving with breathtaking precision, his music commanding the attention of every soul in the room. And then Liam saw his face, the same quiet confidence, the same hands that had touched his broken violin with knowing care. The stranger. Liam's breath caught in his throat. The man who had helped him wasn't just some kind passerby. He was one of the most famous musicians in the world. Liam stared at the screen, his heart pounding in his chest. The man who had stopped to help him, the one who had sent him to that tiny repair shop, wasn't just anyone. He was world-renowned violinist Alexander Calloway, a musician so famous that concert halls filled within minutes of his name appearing on a program. A man whose recordings Liam had listened to for years, dreaming of playing like him one day. But why had someone like Alexander Calloway stopped for him? Why had he cared about a street performer with a broken violin? The questions swirled in Liam's mind, but no answers came. The next day, Liam returned to the park, the same place where his violin had been shattered. This time, it was whole again, its strings humming with life beneath his fingertips. He sat up on the same bench and started to play, but his mind wasn't fully in the music. He kept looking around, scanning the crowd, searching for a familiar face, but Alexander was nowhere to be found. As days passed, Liam threw himself into playing, each note sharper, clearer, more alive than before. Something inside him had changed. Since that moment in the luthier's shop, he wasn't just playing for survival anymore. He was playing with purpose, with hunger. It was as if the encounter with Alexander had unlocked something inside him. Then, one evening, as the sun dipped behind the city skyline, Liam noticed someone watching him from a distance. A tall figure in a long coat, hat pulled low. His heart kicked up a beat. He didn't stop playing. Instead, he let his music grow, pouring all his emotions into the notes. The frustration of never being able to afford proper lessons, the fear of failure, the pure, desperate need to be heard. And then, for the first time in his life, something magical happened. The people walking by didn't just throw coins into his open case. They stopped. They listened. And then, the man in the hat stepped forward. When the last note faded into the air, Liam met his gaze. This time, there was no scarf covering his face. No mystery. It was him. "Why did you help me?" Liam asked, his voice quiet but steady. Alexander studied him for a long moment before answering. "Because I see myself in you." Liam frowned. "You? But you're famous." Alexander interrupted, a hint of a smile tugging at his lips. "That didn't happen overnight." For the first time, Liam saw something in Alexander's eyes that wasn't quiet confidence. It was understanding, a shared past, a story waiting to be told. Alexander sat beside him on the bench, glancing down at the violin in Liam's hands. "I grew up in a small town," he began. "My family didn't have much, but my father loved music. He found an old violin at a pawn shop and gave it to me when I was 8. It was barely playable, but to me, it was everything." He exhaled, as if remembering something distant but vivid. "One day it broke. I thought my world had ended. I had no money to fix it, no teacher to guide me. And then, a stranger helped me." Liam listened, his heart pounding. "Just like you helped me." Alexander nodded. "He didn't ask for anything in return. He just told me to never stop playing." He turned to face Liam fully. "That's why I stopped when I saw you that day. I knew that look in your eyes." Liam swallowed hard. He had spent years believing he was alone in his struggle, that no one understood what it felt like to chase a dream that seemed impossible. But now, sitting beside one of the greatest musicians in the world, he realized something. He wasn't alone. "You have something special," Alexander continued. "But raw talent isn't enough. You need discipline, training." He paused. "Have you ever had a proper lesson?" Liam shook his head. "I taught myself. I watched videos, listened to recordings, but," he hesitated, "I've never had a real teacher." Alexander was quiet for a moment, then reached into his coat pocket. He pulled out a small card and handed it to Liam. It was an address. "Come here tomorrow," Alexander said, "if you're serious about music." Liam stared at the card, his hands trembling. "Is this a place where you can learn?" Alexander said simply. "I can't promise it'll be easy, but if you're willing to fight for it, I'll make sure you get a chance." Liam's breath caught in his throat. A chance. That was all he had ever wanted. But doubt crept in. What if he wasn't good enough? What if Alexander realized he had made a mistake? As if sensing his thoughts, Alexander stood and placed a hand on Liam's shoulder. "You're ready," he said. "You just don't know it yet." And then, just like before, he walked away. Liam sat there for a long time, the city buzzing around him. The card felt heavy in his hands, like the weight of a new future pressing against his palm. He had spent years playing for survival. Now, for the first time, he had a chance to play for something more. But was he ready to take that step? As he looked down at his violin, perfectly repaired, perfectly whole, he knew the answer. Tomorrow he would go. Tomorrow everything would change. Liam barely slept that night. His mind kept circling back to the card in his hand, the weight of Alexander's words pressing into his chest. A chance. The kind of opportunity he had dreamed about, but never thought would actually come. What if he wasn't good enough? What if this was all some mistake? But even as doubt crept in, something stronger pushed it back. The memory of his violin breaking, the feeling of losing everything, and then the miracle of getting it back. He couldn't walk away from this. Not now. The next morning, Liam arrived at the address. It wasn't what he expected. No grand music academy, no towering concert hall. Instead, it was a small, unassuming building tucked between a cafe and a bookstore. A music studio, quiet and unremarkable, except for the fact that Alexander Calloway was standing just outside, waiting for him. "You came," Alexander said, a hint of approval in his voice. Liam nodded, gripping his violin case tightly. "I wasn't sure I should, but you did," Alexander said simply. "That's what matters." Inside, the studio was cozy, but filled with history. Framed photographs lined the walls, portraits of musicians, orchestras, and faded images of a younger Alexander, violin in hand. A grand piano sat in the corner, and shelves overflowed with sheet music. The air smelled of old wood and rosin, like every music room Liam had ever dreamed of being in. Alexander led him to a small practice area and gestured for him to take out his violin. "Play for me." Liam's hands trembled as he lifted the instrument to his shoulder. This wasn't the park. This wasn't playing for spare change. This was a test. He took a deep breath and started to play, choosing a melody that had always been close to his heart, something soft, full of longing, something that carried all the emotion he had never been able to say out loud. When he finished, silence filled the room. Liam's pulse hammered in his ears. He couldn't read Alexander's expression. Was it disappointment? Regret? Had he failed? Then Alexander spoke. "You play like someone who's had to fight for every note." Liam wasn't sure if that was good or bad. "Is that a problem?" Alexander shook his head. "No, it means you understand something most musicians don't." He leaned forward, his gaze sharp. Music isn't just skill. It's not just talent. It's the stories we carry. And you have a story worth telling. Relief flooded Liam's chest. But before he could say anything, Alexander stood. "But you need to train. You have passion, but no discipline. You rely on instinct, but not technique. If you want to go beyond the streets, you need to put in the work." Liam swallowed hard and nodded. "I'll do whatever it takes." And so it began. The lessons were brutal. Hours of scales, exercises that made Liam's fingers ache, drills that forced him to unlearn bad habits he didn't even know he had. Alexander was strict, pushing him harder than he had ever been pushed before. But there were also moments of unexpected kindness, quiet advice, small words of encouragement, and once, after a particularly rough session, Alexander simply saying, "You remind me of myself." Weeks turned into months. Liam kept playing in the park, but something had changed. People stopped to listen, not just out of curiosity, but because they felt something in his music. Videos of his performances started circulating online, gaining attention. And then, one day, everything changed. A famous music director saw one of those videos. An invitation arrived. A chance to audition for a prestigious youth orchestra. It was the kind of opportunity that could change everything. The kind that could launch a real career. Liam could hardly believe it. He rushed to tell Alexander, expecting excitement, maybe even pride. But Alexander's face was unreadable. "This is your moment," Alexander said. "But you have to decide what kind of musician you want to be." Liam frowned. "What do you mean?" Alexander was quiet for a long moment. Then he walked over to a shelf and pulled down an old newspaper. He handed it to Liam. The front page showed a younger Alexander holding his violin on stage. The headline screaming, "Prodigy walks away from fame." Liam looked up in shock. You left." Alexander nodded. "I had everything. Concerts, record deals, a life most musicians dream of. But I was playing music for all the wrong reasons. For money, for approval, for expectations that weren't mine." His gaze met Liam's. "It nearly destroyed me." Liam's heart pounded. "So, you're saying I shouldn't go?" "I'm saying you need to ask yourself why you're going." Alexander leaned forward. "Are you doing this because it's what you love? Or because it's what you think you should do?" Liam didn't know how to answer. The night before the audition, he barely slept. He ran through the piece over and over again, his mind battling with itself. What if he wasn't ready? What if he failed? But more than that, he kept thinking about Alexander's words. When the morning came, Liam stood outside the concert hall, his violin case in his hands. This was everything he had ever wanted, and yet he turned and walked away, not because he was afraid, not because he didn't want it, but because he finally understood. Music wasn't about chasing fame. It wasn't about proving himself to anyone. It was about telling stories, about reaching people, about playing with all the love and pain and hope inside him. Instead of the audition, Liam went to the park. He took his place on the same bench where this all began. And he played. And this time, the crowd wasn't just listening. They were feeling. Somewhere in the distance, Alexander watched, a small smile on his face. Liam had found his music, and that was enough.